adventures of an incredible personality. A being no larger than an ordinary man, but possessed of powers never before realized on Earth. Faster than an airplane, more powerful than a locomotive.
Well, welcome to North Point. I'm so excited you guys are here with us today. As we are kicking off 3 services today, you're in the 11:30, our 3rd service. We're pumped about that. If you're watching online, I just want to say welcome to you as well. We're so excited you're with us. And today we are kicking off this series, or we're not kicking off, we're continuing in this series called Heroes. And before we jump into it, I just want to tell you a little bit about who I am. My name is Jeremy Edelin, and I'm the Service Programming Director here at North Point. I'm so honored and privileged to be here to continue in this series called Heroes. And the reason I'm excited is because for me personally, I love superhero movies. In fact, I love all of these movies right here. Think about the Marvel movies, you know, all the Thor and just every single one. I love all of these movies. And to get us going, I want to try with something a little bit interactive. And for you introverts in the room, you might not like me after we try this. I totally get that. That's okay. But what I want you to do is I want you to turn to somebody next to you or somebody you're sitting next to or close to and tell them your favorite superhero movie. Go ahead. So many options. I'll tell you. Man, there are a lot of extroverts in here. Extroverts, like 10 seconds, that's all it typically takes. You guys are still going. I don't know how, it's like 2-3 words max. I don't know how this happens. Well, anyways, for me, my favorite superhero movie is this one right here. It's in Avengers Infinity War. I don't know if anybody else said this, but this is my favorite one, and it hasn't been out for very long, so I'm not going to spoil the ending for you. But I will say that sitting in that movie theater towards the end of the movie, I looked just like this guy right here. Do you guys remember Tobey Maguire from the first Spider-Man, right? Anybody remember that first Spider-Man movie? Now there's been like 17, right? But for me, that's what I looked like in the movie theater. But again, I love these movies. I could 100% contribute to all the money they've made off of these movies. But one of the things that's funny is that I was actually embarrassed about this a couple years ago. And the reason is because I went to film school at UT. And in film school, it's all about the artsy movies. It's all about those movies that you hear about in the Oscars. And they've won like 8 awards. And you've never even heard about the actors or anybody inside of those movies, right? And for me, one of those movies that I felt bad that I wasn't more into was this movie right here, Boyhood. People loved this movie, and if you love this movie, then more power to you. I'm just stuck in my childhood. I can't seem to get past the Marvel movies. And I love them even though the same thing tends to happen every single movie, right? It's the same story. It's Earth almost gets destroyed, and then a hero saves it every single time. But what's interesting is that not just with these superhero movies, but with any movie in any genre at all, there's actually a similar story structure that happens. And a little film school 101, I'm going to geek out up here. I got the mic, so you guys can't stop me from doing it. But a little film school 101, there's actually this thing called the Hollywood story structure. And the Hollywood story structure, when you contextualize it to superhero films, it looks something like this. You have once upon a time, there's a character, there's somebody, there's a story that starts, and then all of a sudden there's a really nice looking dinosaur who shows up for some reason. You know, there's an enemy, there's an adversity that pops up, there's a conflict. But wait, the superhero shows up, and they come onto the scene. And typically you see in these movies, you see a scene where it doesn't look like they're going to make it, right? You can probably think about scenes that you've seen. It doesn't look like they're going to make it, and then they muster the strength and the willpower to end up winning. And this isn't just true of superhero movies. Think about how many 80s movies have an airport scene, right? How many 80s movies, it looks like it's not going to happen, it's not going to work out, and then he runs through the airport and he saves the day, right? That happens in romantic comedies. It happens in scary movies. Sometimes you don't know if they're going to make it out alive. It's a scary movie, so sometimes they just don't, and then the movie ends, and that's pretty much it. So if you like scary movies, then kudos to you. But a lot of times, it ends with a happily ever after. A happily ever after, the hero saves the day. And a lot of movies go something like this, not just superhero movies, but movies in general. But what's interesting is if you talk to any screenwriter or any film producer, what you discover is that the most important part of any story or any movie is this part right here. All of a sudden. All of a sudden. Because all of a sudden we see an enemy, we have loss, there's adversity, and there is a conflict. And if you talk to any movie producer or screenwriter, what you discover is that the conflict is the most important part of the story because the conflict sets the stakes. And the conflict says, here's what this hero or here's what this person is going to have to overcome in order to win in the end. And as we watch these movies, what we discover is that the greater the conflict, the greater the adversity, the greater the loss, the greater the story. For instance, this movie right here. Anybody a fan of Gladiator? Yes. Yeah, I got some like fist pumps in the back. That's awesome. Gladiator is such a good movie, and I think the reason that we lean in so much in this movie is because of the massive adversity and conflict that happens in the beginning. Maximus loses everything, his wealth, his family, his position in the Roman Empire, and the rest of the movie is him trying to get that back, him fighting back. That's why we lean in, and we're so in tune with this movie. If you're a parent here, then I know what your favorite movie of all time is. Your favorite movie is this one right here. Right? You guys have only seen it maybe once or twice, maybe 500 times. I don't know, but this movie, there's great adversity that happens, right? You know, Anna has to go save her sister Elsa. She has to bring her back, get her to stop making everything so cold, get her to just let it go. Guys, get it, let it go? Yeah, that worked. Cool. But what happens in a lot of these stories is there's a conflict that occurs, and as the story goes, the conflict begins to change. And the conflict begins to turn from the enemy to the hero themselves. And what we begin to see is that the greatest enemy in their hero story becomes or is themselves. It turns inward. They have to find the willpower, the strength to muster up the energy to defeat whatever enemy it is. You know, Thor's greatest enemy becomes Thor. Iron Man's greatest enemy becomes Iron Man. Batman's greatest enemy becomes Ben Affleck because he sucks at playing Batman. Right? People are clapping for that one. That's awesome. What we see is that these heroes, their conflict becomes themselves. They have to muster up the strength to defeat whatever it is, but they have to conquer their own willpower first. And the reason I share all of that and the reason I'm geeking out about all this film stuff is because, one, I'm super interested in it and I love it, but also because I think there's something we can learn from it. And the reason I think we can learn from it is because I think that everybody in here has a story that they are telling with their life. And I think that we even have the opportunity to write and tell a hero story with our life. And a hero story looks like getting to the end of our life and having, done the career that we wanted to do, having had the family that we wanted to do, having led well, having our hopes, our dreams, our desires, our expectations become fulfilled, come to fruition. And we can tell stories to our kids and our grandkids and our great-grandkids, and we can be proud of the legacy that we left. It's a hero story that we can tell with our lives. But I also know to be true with these superheroes who face conflict oftentimes in our hero stories, as we attempt to tell the best story possible in our lives, that we face conflict as well. And because of that, I think that the greatest enemy in our hero stories is ourselves as well. And here's why I think that's true. You see, we all experience wounds in our life. Maybe it's bullying, maybe it's abuse, maybe it's a broken relationship, maybe it's a divorce, maybe it's death of a loved one, maybe it's financial hardship. We all experience wounds throughout our life. And oftentimes what I know to be true is that these wounds, it isn't our wounds that shape us, but how we respond to them. It isn't our wounds that shape us, but how we respond to them. This is so important because it isn't our wounds that tell our story for us, that tell the ending of our story. It is how we respond to the wounds in our life. Think about it this way. We all know two different stories. People who have faced the exact same hardship in life. And on one side of this hardship, the person took whatever happened to them and it took them out. There was pain, there was hurt, and it perpetuated a cycle of pain, and they ultimately didn't tell the story they wanted to tell. But on the flip side, the other person who experienced the exact same wound in their life, they took that pain and they learned a lesson from it, they channeled it, and they actually told a better story as a result of what they experienced. The same wound, two different stories, two different outcomes. Why? Because it isn't the wounds that shape us, it isn't the wounds that tell our story, but how we respond to them. But if you're anything like me and you don't always get it right, what I know to be true is that oftentimes we respond to wounds in such a way that create enemies in our life. And I'm not necessarily talking about people enemies. It could be that for you. but enemies in the sense that we have an internal struggle that begins to develop, things that keep us from telling the best story of our life. And maybe for you, the greatest enemy in your hero story is fear. Maybe it's fear. Maybe you grew up and you didn't have a lot of control in your life, and so now that you're an adult, you want control at all points, at all times, because you're so fearful of what's going to happen in the future, of what could happen in the future. And so the greatest enemy that keeps you, that debilitates you from experiencing an incredible story is fear. Or maybe for you, you experienced a relationship and there was a broken trust in that relationship, and as a result of the hurt that you experienced, it created a fear for being in another relationship in the future. And so you can't tell the hero story of your life where you end up in a great relationship because of the walls you've put up as a result of it, that your response has been fear. Or maybe for you, the greatest enemy in your hero story is insecurity. Oftentimes we look around and we see everything else that everybody else has, and it creates a wound in us. And the reason is because we begin to try and tell everybody else's story, but we forget to tell our own story. And as a result of that, we're constantly chasing everybody else's life, the vacations, the cars, the kids that can speak like 12 languages, all that stuff. We begin chasing that. And it creates a fear, it creates a wound of insecurity in our life, an enemy of insecurity. Maybe for you, the greatest enemy in your hero story is shame. Maybe it's shame. Maybe it's something that you believe about yourself as a result of something that happened to you. You wouldn't say that you make bad decisions. You would say that you're a bad person. Somebody said, "What is wrong with you?" over and over and over again growing up. For me, this is a personal one, and it's personal not for me specifically, but for my wife. And I asked her if I could share this because it's a little bit of a sensitive topic for us, but she experienced a shame wound in her life growing up. Her name is Ashley. Her maiden name is Reed, Ashley Reed, and she's dyslexic. And so when she was in elementary school, when she would get asked to read in front of the other kids in class, she got nicknamed Ashley Can't Read. And she took this wound with her. And throughout school, even as we started to date in high school, I noticed this thing in her that she didn't think she was smart. And she's incredibly brilliant. But she always felt like she just wasn't smart enough. And it's something that we've had to talk through and work through even in our marriage. And it's been an enemy in her hero story. Maybe for you can relate, or maybe for you it's pride. Maybe for you it's pride. Maybe the fact that you don't want to show weakness is your very weakness, the thing that keeps you from experiencing a hero story. Maybe for you it's ambition. Maybe it's the need to drive and the need to succeed in life is costing you a lot of things, and it's actually ruining your story. Maybe for you it's numbness. Maybe for you the enemy in your life is the need to numb. Because of a painful wound that might have happened at some point, the only thing you can do is look for something to numb, to look for that habit or look for that drink or whatever it is, and you have to numb the pain that you experienced, and that numbing, that habit, whatever it is, keeps you from experiencing an incredible story in your life. See, I think we all have wounds, and we all take these wounds and we respond to them, but oftentimes I think that these responses create enemies in our stories. And I want to pause here because I think something that's so important is that I don't want to belittle or I don't want to minimize any sort of wound that you've ever experienced in your life. And I also don't want to pretend to know every single wound that you've experienced. Because I recognize that in a room full of a couple hundred people, chances are there are things happening, or there are things that have happened that are unspeakable that we wouldn't wish on anybody in their stories. And so I don't want to pretend to know what you're going through, but I do know, based on my experience, based on what I've seen, that we all have wounds. And because of these wounds, we respond in ways that oftentimes don't help our story. And because of that, to circle back around to the idea that we are our own enemies in our hero story, when you think about your life, chances are the greatest enemy in your hero story is you. When I think about my story, I am the greatest enemy because of how I've chosen to respond to things in my life. We are the greatest enemies of the story of our life. And this isn't just a Jeremy thing or a church thing. I think this is a people and life thing. In fact, if you've ever learned anything about psychology or you've studied psychology, you might recognize this term right here, a locus of control. And the locus of control is essentially the idea that we have control over certain things in our life, but that we choose what we get to control. And what I mean by that is this: it's broken up into two different parts. And the first part is the internal locus of control. And the internal locus of control is everything that we do have control over in our life, the choices that we can make, the things that we actually control. And then on the outside is the external locus of control. And these are the things that we don't have a say in. These are the things that dictate our life, the wounds that happen to us throughout our life. And the idea behind the locus of control is that we have a choice as to where we live within it. That when we live within the external locus of control, that we essentially look to all the things around us. We don't take control for ourselves. We blame, and we blame, and we play the victim card, and we blame everybody around us for our own decisions and our own circumstances. But when we live in the internal locus of control, we recognize that this door to our life, living in the external, the lock is on the outside, we can't get to it. But when we live in the internal, that we see that the lock is on the inside of the door, that we do have a choice, that we are responsible for our own responses. And I would love for every single person in this room to live within the internal locus of control, because I think that it is in that moment when we take responsibility that we begin to tell the best story possible for our lives. And you might push back on me when I say this, but isn't it true? Isn't it true that oftentimes that we choose to allow these things to dictate our life? That we choose to allow pride and anxiety and fear and shame and guilt to tell the story for us instead of us telling our own story? And I don't want that to be the case. I so want each person in this room to tell the best story with their life. And because of that, I want to share what I believe to be the best strategy and the best response that I have learned to seeing things differently, seeing your wounds differently. And I'm not saying you're going to walk out of here and you're going to begin a new chapter of your story, of your life, but I do think that if you make this response and this strategy a habit, I think that potentially you can begin to turn the page to a new chapter in your life. And this is a very unexpected response. It's a very unexpected strategy from an unexpected story. And it's a story of a guy named Paul. And Paul existed around 2,000 years ago, and Paul was a Pharisee shortly after the time of Jesus. And a Pharisee was essentially a religious leader at the time. And Paul made it his number one goal to try and stomp out and try and stop this new faith that was arising. And it was this faith of Christianity. And he made it his goal to capture and kill and hurt as many Christians as possible. And then one day, he's on the road to Damascus. It's a story called The Road to Damascus. And he's on this road to this city called Damascus. And as he's on this road, he's going to capture more Christians. And he experiences something that changes his life because he experiences a vision. And I don't know about you, but I've personally never experienced a vision. And I think I'd be terrified if I did hear the voice of God at some point. If you've heard the voice of God, I want to talk to you because I want to know what that's like. That's pretty cool. But for me, I've never experienced a vision, but this thing seemed to rock Paul so much that his life took a complete 180-degree turn. And what happened is Paul actually became a Christian because he saw and heard from the risen Jesus in this vision. And his life took a turn in that now he became a Christian and he became a part of the very movement that he was trying to stop. And he went on to help start many churches around the Mediterranean area, some of the churches of the first century. He went on to speak to thousands and thousands and thousands of people, and he went on to write almost half of the New Testament. But what's interesting about the story of Paul is that, oftentimes we have this stereotype that when we become a Christian, or if we become a Christian, that things just get easier from there. It's like rainbow puking unicorns from there on out, right? That's just not what happens. And Paul experienced this because Paul experienced wounds throughout his life after he became a Christian. Some of these wounds that he experienced was he was forsaken. He was left by family and friends as a result of this new life he adopted. He was misunderstood. He taught the teachings of Jesus, which were often countercultural to what was happening at this time, and so he's misunderstood. As a result, he was beaten. He said he was beaten more times than he can count. He was starved. He was malnourished, going from town to town to town, not knowing where he was going to get his next meal. He was shipwrecked 3 times, nearly dying every time. He was stoned. They stoned him and they walked away because they thought that he was dead, but he hung on within an inch of his life and he got up. He continued on. He was imprisoned because of the things that he said. And then his worst wound, or so he tells us, is what he calls his thorn. A thorn in his side. And the thorn in his side is something that we don't know what it actually was, but he writes about it in the New Testament. But he says that it was his most debilitating wound, and scholars believe it to be a mental or physical ailment that he experienced. And as a result of all these wounds throughout his life, the way his life ended is that he was martyred. He was beheaded for what he believed to be true. And I think we would look at the life of Paul and we would say, man, that is a guy who's experienced incredible hardship, incredible wounds throughout his life. And you would say that is a guy who has every excuse in the book to live within the external locus of control, to blame the circumstances around him for his actions. But you see, he didn't do that. He chose a different response, a different strategy that we're going to learn from today. And I think because he did this in his story, it is the very thing that made him a hero in his story. You see, the reason we know about the whole thorn thing is because he wrote a letter to the church of Corinth. And in this letter, he describes his thorn, and he talks about how it's debilitating him and making his life difficult. And he says he prayed and he begged and he asked God to take this thorn away time and time and time again. And then he said he heard from God, and he learned something in the process of asking God to take this thing away. And here's what he writes in that letter. He says, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. My grace is sufficient for you. In other words, Paul, you want me to take this thing away, but I'm telling you that I'm not going to. I'm not going to take it away. Why? Because my grace is sufficient for you. And when we read this too fast, we miss the incredible word grace, because I think oftentimes that word is just thrown around in many contexts. But when you translate this word to the original Greek language, the word is charis. And what charis means is power or strength or peace in hardship, going through hardship in life. And so what God is saying to Paul is, Paul, you want me to take these things away, but I'm telling you, my grace, my strength, my power, my peace is enough for you. That you're going to get through this because I'm going to carry you through whatever you are going through because my grace is enough for you. You don't need me to take these things away. And I think we hear that, and oftentimes we go, okay, that's great. High level, that sounds nice. But in reality, that's much more difficult to swallow. It's much more difficult to apply in our life, I think. And for me personally, seeing this phrase, my grace is sufficient for you, has become a very personal phrase in my life. And the reason is because within the past year of my life, I experienced a very significant wound. And this wound came in the form of a piece of information. And it was one of those pieces of info that kind of turns your world upside down. Maybe you can relate to this. Maybe it was a medical thing, or maybe it was a job thing or a family thing. But for me, it completely rocked my world. And as a result, I found myself with fear and insecurity as my responses. And it's getting in the way, it continues to get in the way, something I'm working through as I think about telling my story in my life. And I found myself saying the same things to God that Paul said, God, why can't you just take this away? Why can't you just change the circumstance? Why can't you just fix this thing that's happening to me? And throughout this season, I've heard this phrase, my grace is sufficient for you, over and over and over again. And I think God is saying to me, saying to you, he's saying to Paul, that with whatever you're going through, I understand it, but I just want you to know that I love you and I'm for you. And because of that, I want you to know that my grace, my strength is enough for you. It's going to get you through this. And not only that, but Paul continues on. He says that for my power is made perfect in weakness. My grace is enough for your life to get through this, and my power is made perfect in weakness. In other words, my power, God is saying my power, my strength, my peace is not only going to get you through this, but it's made perfect in your weakness. In other words, that you're going to grow as a result of this. You're going to come out stronger on the other side of this, is what he's telling Paul. He's saying, Paul, you're going to grow more in the mountains than you are in the valleys. Or you're going to grow more in the valleys than you are in the mountains. You're going to grow more when you need me than when you don't. He's saying, Paul, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. And I think we've all heard something like this in life. I think we all intuitively know that we grow in our failures. Maybe you've been in business or an organizational situation where you've made a decision and you've grown as a result of that decision. You made a better decision later on. Or maybe for you in parenting, maybe for those of you who have kids, you guys know that sometimes, you let your kids fail at some point because they're going to learn and they're going to grow in the process. For me, being on the other side of so many stories here at North Point and hearing stories of people's lives when we've shot videos and things like that, I've heard a lot of stories of people's wounds that they have experienced in their life. And as they've experienced these wounds and they're telling their story, they get towards the end and they always say something along the lines of, man, I didn't know it at the time, but I'm so glad that happened to me, because I grew in the process. I wouldn't be who I am today if that hadn't occurred to me in my life. That wound shaped who I am today. I grew as a result of it. Why? Because his grace is sufficient. His power is made perfect in weakness. And one of my favorite authors, his name is Brennan Manning, he says it best like this, in my opinion. He says, it remains a startling story to those who never understand that the men and women who are truly filled with light, those who truly get life, those who truly experience the best story possible, are those who have gazed deeply into the darkness of their imperfect existence. Those who have gazed deeply into the darkness of their imperfect existence. In other words, those who have been through the valleys of life, those who have had hardships and wounds, they've come out better on the other side because they've learned and they've grown as a result of the wounds in their life. And I think that maybe some of us in here might know people like this. For me, there's one particular person who I would say has been a light to me, and he would say that the reason he's able to relate with me is because he's been through the valleys, that he's able to look at me and say, you know what, I've been there too. I understand what you're going through, and I promise you that you're going to grow, and God is going to do something unexpected only in his power and his strength as a result of what you're going through. And this is what Paul is learning. Paul is learning that God's grace is sufficient in what he's going through. And not only that, but God's strength is going to show up in a way that only God's strength can show up. And his power is made perfect in weakness. And Paul realizes this. He begins to shift his perspective. He begins to shift his strategy on how he's viewing his wounds. He no longer looks at God and says, God, take these away. God, make this different. Change this circumstance. But he changes his perspective, and look what he says. He says, therefore, I will boast. I will boast, I will be excited, I will be joyful, all the more gladly of my weaknesses, of my wounds, of my conflicts, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. He changes his perspective and he says, I now see that when I go through the valleys, I come out better on the other side, and as a result of that, I'm going to boast, I'm going to be joyful because I know that God is going to take me through this. He goes on, he wraps it up, and he says, for the sake of Christ then, I am content. I am at peace with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities, all the wounds that he's experienced. And then he says this, for when I am weak, then I am strong. See, he recognizes that in his weakness, he's growing, he's learning, because God's power is showing up, and it's making him stronger as a result of it. And Paul learned something that's relevant to each of us in our stories and the wounds that we face and the things that we try to get over, and it is this. It is that God sees our greatest challenge as our greatest opportunity. He sees our greatest wound, our greatest conflict as our greatest opportunity to grow, to learn, to rely on him in a new way, and for his power to show up only in a way that his power can show up. Our greatest challenge could very well be our greatest opportunity, and Paul begins to see it this way, and he asks God, God, help me see it like you see it. And I think this is true not just with the larger things of life that Paul is going through, but with the smaller things of life as well, kind of our day-to-day choices and our day-to-day struggles. In fact, Ashley and I came back from vacation this past week. We got back from the beach, and we got back to our apartment, and it was Memorial Day. It was like 105 degrees outside, and we walked into our apartment, and it was 91 in our apartment. And, you know, a total, like, first world problem, but we live in Texas, so it's a big deal. And we get in there, and we're like, okay, we don't know why. We left it at 80. It shouldn't be this way. And then Ashley looks at me like I'm going to fix it or something. And then she remembers that, you know, you work for a church. You don't know what to do with this kind of stuff. And so I don't know what to do, so I call the maintenance guy, and the maintenance guy doesn't answer because it's Memorial Day, and we go, okay, we're just going to have to tough it out. And then I did what any adult, mature man would do, and I threw a temper tantrum. And I began unpacking our suitcase and throwing clothes in the corner. And I've been yelling at the dogs. I was saying things that people who work for a church probably shouldn't say under their breath, but I was saying them anyways. I was being mean to Ashley. And then we're getting ready for bed, and she turns to me, and she says this, and it made me so mad in the moment, but after she said it, I was like, okay. She said, you know what, this is kind of cool. I was like, really, it's cool? Really, it's cool? She says, you know what, this is kind of cool. We were just at the beach, and now it's like we're camping in our apartment. And in that moment, I just turned to her and I thought to myself, babe, you are so sexy. Babe, you are so sexy. Because that's so true. And she took this little tiny challenge and she saw it differently than I did. She saw it as an opportunity. She saw it as something that we could have fun with. And I think this happens with little situations in life, but I think it also happens with the much larger things as well, as we see in the life of Paul. I have a great friend and mentor who's just gone through hell sideways and experienced some really difficult hardships. And it's been over the past couple years, and he's had to learn from these things and process these things. And he said something to me a couple months ago, and I texted him this week and asked him if I could share it with you guys. And here's what he said. He says that through this, I feel like God has told me, you've done more for me, having been transformed by your pain, than you could have ever done for me before. You've done more for me, being transformed by your pain, than you could have ever done for me before. In other words, he's learned that on the other side of this wound that he's experienced, that God has done more in him, and he's done more for God because of God's power and strength in him than he could have ever done otherwise. That this obstacle, this great wound that he experienced, became a great opportunity in his life, and he grew as a result of it. And he's one of the greatest men that I know. I've never met somebody who loves people as well as he does. I've never met somebody who loves the church and loves his family and loves his community as well as he does. And it's been a privilege to even just learn from him. But he saw his greatest obstacle as his greatest opportunity. And maybe, I don't know if you're like me and you're an ABC kind of person. You want to know step 1, 2, 3 to apply certain things in your life. That's not really how this works, though. It's more of a shift in perspective, a change in your viewpoint. But I think there are 2 practical things that you can do and that you can walk away with today. And the first is this, is that when it comes to wounds in your life, that you can flip the script. You can flip the script. You see, often when we face a wound in our life, we have 2 different sides of our brain that react. We have the emotional side of our brain, and we have the logical truth side of our brain. And what happens when we experience a wound is that the volume of the emotional side of our brain gets turned up to a point where we don't really hear the volume of the logical truth side of our brain. And we begin to say things like this. We say, I know blank, but I feel blank. And fill in the blank with whatever it might be for you. I know they didn't mean to hurt me, but I just feel so angry. Or I know I'm loved, but I just feel so alone. I know I have value, but I just feel worthless. And when we say things like this, when we think things like this, and we think in this way, what happens is we negate the truth, what we know to be true, with what we are feeling. And we turn down the logical side of our brain, and we allow our emotions to dictate our story. And in that kind of situation, it is impossible to see your greatest obstacle as your greatest opportunity, your greatest challenge as your greatest opportunity. And so with these thoughts, what do? Well, we flip the script. We say it the opposite way. We say, I feel, but I know. I feel blank, whatever it is for you, but I know this. In other words, I feel hurt, but I know they didn't mean to do it. I feel unloved, but I know that God loves me, he loves them, and maybe I can process forgiveness with that. I feel like I don't matter, but I know that God sees me as his son or his daughter. And when we begin to let the script of our wounds in our life be this way, we turn down the volume of our emotional side, not all the way because it's important to feel those things, but we turn down the side of our emotional brain and we turn up the side of our logical, truth-oriented brain. And what happens is we begin to see our greatest challenges as our greatest opportunities. And the second thing you can do is this, is to wake up every day and say this statement, God only gives me enough grace for today. See, oftentimes in wounds in our life, we want to look forward a week, a month, a year, and we want to ask God for grace and comfort and strength in those times. But grace doesn't work that way. His strength, his peace doesn't work that way. See, it's like oxygen. We can only take a breath for now. I can't take a breath for 10 seconds from now. I can't take a breath for a week from now or a year from now, and grace is the same way. We can only ask God for enough grace, the grace that is sufficient, the power that is made perfect in our weakness, in the moment, day by day by day, and be comforted day by day. And over time, we begin to see our greatest challenges as our greatest opportunities. And so flip the script and say to yourself every single day, God only gives me enough grace for today. Those are 2 incredible things that I've learned in my life. But for the rest of our time as we wrap up, I just want to flip it around to you. I want you to think about your story, the things, the hero stories that you are trying to tell in your life, whatever those circumstances, those situations, those areas of your life it might be. And I want to ask you a couple questions as you think about those things. The first question is this, is what challenge are you currently facing? What wound, what conflict are you currently face to face with? And as a result of this challenge, what response is dictating your story? What response is dictating your story? What response is currently happening in your life that you are responding to a wound in a certain way, and you're allowing that response to create an enemy of fear, of anxiety, of shame, whatever it is, and that response is telling your story for you instead of you telling your own story? What response is doing that in your life? And as you think about your response, are you relying on God's strength or are you relying on your own strength? Are you relying on your own strength or are you leaning into a strength that is sufficient for you, a strength that is made perfect in your weakness, a strength that shows up in the only way that God's strength can show up, more wild and unimaginable than anything that we can possibly imagine? But if we try to white knuckle it and we try to just, say, I can do it, I'm going to do better, I'm going to beat this, oftentimes we forget that his grace is enough. And my last question is this: what challenge do you need to view as an opportunity? What challenge, what wound, what conflict do you need to view as an opportunity to grow? And would you be willing to recognize that God's grace is enough with whatever you're going through, and that his infinite power is going to show up in a way that only it can if you shift your perspective and you allow yourself to see whatever wound and challenge you're going through as an opportunity to grow, and to know that he's going to bring you out of this and you're going to be better off on the other side because of it. What challenge are you currently facing? How are you responding? Are you relying on your strength or God's? And would you be willing to see it as an opportunity? If you're here and you're not a Christian, then I realize when I talk about God's grace and church and all these things that it's like, okay, well, that doesn't really apply to me. And that's totally okay. If that's you, I totally get that, and I'm glad you're here. And here would be my challenge to you. I would just ask you the question: did you know that this strength, this peace, this grace is available to you? Did you know that this is an option for you? That if you put your faith and trust in Christ and trust that he is who he claimed to be, that this grace, this power made perfect in weakness, can do unimaginable things in your life and in the story that you were trying to tell? And would you be willing to take a step in that direction? Not a full step if that makes you uncomfortable, but just to step and talk to somebody, call somebody, ask whatever question is keeping you away from that. Would you be willing to take a step and potentially begin to see the greatest challenge in your life as an opportunity? Would you be willing to do that? For all of us in here, if you're a Christian, if you're not a Christian, just imagine what our lives would look like if we truly practiced this. If we truly woke up every day and we said, God, you give me enough grace for today. If we truly woke up every day and we flipped the script and we said, we're not going to allow our wounds and our emotions to dictate what we know to be true, and as a result of this, we're going to tell a better story. Imagine what God would do with the conflicts and the things that we face internally. Imagine how he would conquer those. And imagine the stories that God would tell in our lives if we allowed him to do so, and if we allowed ourselves to see our obstacles, our wounds, the way he does as opportunities to grow. Imagine what would happen. If you're here and you're experiencing a wound or a conflict and you feel like it's just completely taken you out, and the thought of seeing it as an opportunity just makes you sick to your stomach, then my piece of advice for you would be this: is to come back next week. Come back next week. And I know that's not emotionally satisfying, but next week there's going to be an incredible story shared, an incredible message. It's my friend Lauren Espy. She's going to tell her story, the wound that she experienced, the opportunity that came out of it. And my hope is that it is as encouraging and inspiring to you as it was to me. But it does start with us. Today, you can choose to tell a better story, but you have to change your strategy and begin to see your greatest challenges as your greatest obstacles, the way God sees them, and see what he does in your story when you begin to see them that way. Let me go ahead and pray for our time. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for your goodness and your grace, the strength, the peace that you provide to us despite what we're going through. And then, God, not only do you bring us through it, but your power shows up in a way that only your power and your strength can show up, and it changes our story beyond our wildest dreams. God, we thank you for that. And God, I just ask that you would help us to flip the script, to remind ourselves what is true constantly and not allow our emotions to dictate what is going on in our stories, and to wake up every day and receive the grace that you give us on a daily basis. And God, thank you that that grace comes to us as a result of your Son, Jesus. Help us experience that more. And it is in his name that we pray. Amen. You guys have a great week. We'll see you next week for part 4.